Time to take a coding break. Howdy, coding pros. This is your medical coding coach as well as your medical coding instructor, Tam Talk, here to talk about all things medical coding related, the good, the bad, and the ugly during this episode of the Coding Break podcast. So today we're going to focus on compliance. Again, compliance, the legalities as relates to healthcare. One, who's involved in compliance, why were the compliance policies created, and how does it affect the medical coding industry. So compliance was created, or the compliance policies were created to ensure trust, to ensure rules and laws are being abided by, or they're being followed, to protect the organization, the healthcare organizations such as your hospitals, your office, medical practices, and other organizations pertaining to the healthcare entity. So those things, what are some of the things that if we're not compliant, how can that affect us? So the first thing that comes to mind as we're talking about medical coding is the billing and coding. Sometimes we can overbill, or we can underbill, or we can commit fraud. I mean, over and underbilling is kind of fraudulent, I guess. Yeah, it's fraudulent, but more so is there to ensure that there's trust. Like, for example, patient confidentiality. Again, making sure we're not over and underbilling, or we're billing for things that we never performed, to get the monetary reimbursements for those services. So again, those compliance policies are in place to ensure, as a way, or as a mechanism to ensure that we are, or the organization is following the rules. So again, these compliance policies apply to all employees, not just a few, not just those under leadership. It applies to all. ALL. This includes the employers, the owners, the founders, the leaders, the managers, directors, the employees, the medical coders, the custodial staff, everyone. You name the title. If they work for the organization, the compliance policies applies to them. Okay? So this is why, if you're working for an organization, this is why you're constantly, every year, you're going through this series of webinars about fraud and abuse, compliance, and OSHA, all of these good webinars, and you have to attest and sign off or whatever that you have reviewed the webinars, you've been brought up to date about the webinar, you've been given the information as it relates to reporting compliance issues, like who to call or who to email, and all those good things, and what's the recourse if you do reports an issue, right? And sometimes it may not even be an issue, but you just, to be on the safe side, you report it. And also to distinguish between a human resource issue or a compliance issues. And we'll get into that into another episode, the difference between human resource and compliance issues. But how does compliance impact medical coders? So I briefly mentioned it in the beginning that it pertains to us because of the billing and the coding, right? The billing and the coding. Again, sometimes we have providers, or maybe it's the coders, who are actually overbilling or overcoding services, which includes bundling of services that are typically bundled together, but we're unbundling them to try to get more reimbursement from the insurance payers. And then sometimes we undercode, it's still fraud, whether you're overcoding or undercoding. And you may say, well, how does undercoding, what does that have to do with being fraudulent? Sometimes you may have friends, families that come in and receive services, and in order for, you may reduce the cost of that particular services for that family member or friend, and we call it a discount, right? Yeah, so we call it a discount. And does this apply? Do we see this a lot in healthcare? As a compliance professional, I can attest that these things do go on in the healthcare entities, especially in the medical billing and coding sector of the healthcare. So yes, you want to be mindful of that. So sometimes as a medical coder, when we are reporting multiple services, if we're not careful, we may not understand how the bundling works. So for those of you who are new to medical coding, you may hear the words unbundling. Make sure your services are bundled. Edits, modifier 59, things of that nature. There are modifiers that will allow for certain services to be unbundled, and it's going to be based on the service that was provided as well as the documentation. This is the importance of reading the documentation. And this is also very important why the providers should be very detailed or very specific in their documentation, because it's going to be contingent on how those codes are selected. So unbundling, for example, is if you have, let's say there were two services performed, and typically, these services are bundled, they're performed together. But there may be some instances where these services should be reported separately. So this is why the documentation has to be very specific and detailed. And if there's a chance that these services can be performed separately or unbundled, then there's a modifier that can be used, and typically it's like modifier 59, to differentiate between the services, or let the insurance payer know that this service was provided outside of the normal routine of this and the other services being performed or provided. So that's where you hear someone say, "Oh, you unbundled the service," or whatever, or if a insurance company said these services were unbundled. Yeah, does that happen out of fraud? There are times where coders don't know that they're unbundling services, so they need to be educated. And then there are coders who do know that they're unbundling to recoup that additional reimbursement from payers, or an attempt to recoup the additional monetary reimbursement from the payers. So trust me, you're being audited. So this is why it is important to have internal audits. Internal audits is if your services are tracked internally, then you're able to rectify the situation before it becomes something bigger, right? And like I said, some coders may knowingly, or some may be unbundling or doing things unknowingly because they haven't been fully educated or trained on that. So we have to do an internal audit to ensure that those services or those issues are rectified. Sometimes those issues are found through an audit, or it may be a payer noticed a trend of certain procedures or services being performed, which may also trigger an audit, right? And so, we have to have proper practices and policies in place so that we can, rectify those issues or circumvent those issues. Also, it affords an opportunity for us to provide education, not only just to coders, but to billers and other staffs that are involved in the revenue cycle. And so, now I will say this, there are some that will have a notebook of policies, right? That doesn't mean that you're compliant. Just having a notebook or a binder full of policies without the application of those policies in your organization, it does not equate to you being compliant. It's just a binder with some policies, right? That's all it is. But there has to be proof of practical application of said policies to justify or to deem that you are in compliance. One is having a compliance program, right? Compliance program, that's where those policies come into play as well. But the program is actually a program that is working. It is effective. It is capturing issues, rectifying those issues, educating the staff, Again, the yearly webinars, you have to attest to and watch. And so these things are important. This is the reason why it is very important that we have an effective compliance program. And then again, I will also go into detail about it in another episode. But yes, but those webinars that we have to go through each year is not just for employees. It is for everyone. The founder, the directors, the board, the executive board, all that. Everyone must abide by these policies. Everyone must go through this training each year and attest to their understanding of it. Right? Everyone, if from the top to the bottom, if they have an issue, a compliance issue, the same process or protocol that the other employees have to abide by or follow through, they have to follow that same process as well. They don't get like a pass because they are a leader or because they are the owner or because they don't get a pass to I won't say disregard the compliance program, because again, although there are internal audits, there are also external audits. Like I stated, if you have a coder who is unknowingly submitting certain charges or codes or claims, and then the payer, they're auditing, especially if they notice a trend, they can come back and report back to that organization to do an audit, right? And it has been done. They may request an audit of those services or for that a specific provider or providers, and they will again audit them. I've been in certain situations where these services have these situations or these services incidents have occurred where the provider triggered an audit, right? I've had to actually go and audit behind the external auditors, right, to ensure that the provider or the provider staff was on point, right? So yeah, because if not, then the provider will have to send a large monetary, a very large check to these payers, right? And for reimbursement of those services that are, I guess you say, are deemed fraudulent or are deemed like the insurance company or the insurance payer reimburse the organization for services that were technically not rendered or they were rendered incorrectly or what have you. So not only are they reimbursing the provider or the healthcare entity have to reimburse the insurance carrier, they have to include, this is included on top of fines that they have to pay as well. So yeah, I say all that to say that the compliance policies, the compliance program, the rules, the regulations, the training, all that is applicable for all employees. It's not just one employee, it's for all, ALL, from the top to the bottom. So that's all that I have for this coding break. So yes, we'll definitely dive deeper into like the compliance program, like what's involved in that, all that good stuff as it relates to the compliance program, and specifically as it relates to medical coding. How can a medical coder prevent this from happening to them, like where they could lose their certification, how they can end up paying fines, how they can actually end up being terminated, and what protocol to take in the compliance program. Like, is this considered a human resource issue or is it considered a compliance issue? But we'll dive into that into future episodes. So that's all that I wanted to talk about in this episode. This coding break, again, give you some segue into compliance and who must abide by the compliance rules, the policies. Again, it's everyone, not just the coders, not just, billers, not just everyone. So that's all that I have for this coding break. And as always, remember to code on. So until next time, toodles.